I'd like to introduce Don and Diane, who will introduce our speaker and our session for today. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, actually, Diane's going to do the introduction today. She's my partner here.
Okay. Thank you, Julianne. Today, it's my privilege to introduce Christopher Goddard, who now has earphones on. Chris is a Canadian composer and pianist who is currently adjunct faculty at the University of Florida. He holds a Doctor of Music degree in composition from McGill University in Montreal, a master's degree in music in contemporary performance from Manhattan School of Music in New York, a second master's of music and composition from Rice, and a bachelor's of music in composition and theory from McGill again. Chris is active as a pianist in solo, chamber ensemble, orchestral, and collaborative settings. He has toured nationally in the United States and Canada, and has also toured internationally. This is a busy man. His compositions span the musical world of works for solo instruments, small and large ensembles, orchestras, and choral settings. He is an associate member of the Canadian Music Center and has served as artistic director of Ottawa New Music Creators. While here in Gainesville, he has presented performances at the Holy Trinity Episcopal Church, where they have a concert series. And some of you may have seen him there. I believe, Chris, your next presentation will be there in March of this year. I think that's
right. That's right.
Yep. On the 13th, you can tell us more about that.
Sure.
So Don and I are very pleased to have all of you meet this very talented composer, Christopher Goddard. Chris, it's up to you now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction. Yeah, it's really great to be here with you today. I've talked to Dr. Lee. He's a friend of mine. He said it was a lot of fun when he did his presentation. So looking forward to some good discussion. I know we have some time reserved at the end of after an hour or so for discussion, but certainly at any point during the presentation, if you want to use the raised hand function, if you're comfortable, just speak up. I'd be happy to answer any questions. So as Diane said, yeah, I'm a resident of Gainesville, but as you could sort of tell from my resume there, I'm from Canada originally. So I moved to Gainesville, I think it was February 2019, which it seems like 10 years ago, but I think it's about 3 years ago now. Exactly 3 years ago now I think about it. So yeah, I moved here after my doctorate at McGill because my wife, she actually studies aging. She's not a musician at all. She studies clinical aging and cell biology, that sort of thing. And her advisor at McGill happened to be poached by the Aging Institute at UF just as she was finishing up her doctorate, and she was doing her work around the same time as me. And you know, academia being what it is, she jumped on the opportunity to do a postdoc, and I sort of didn't know exactly where I was going to be landing, and I was looking for a new change. I'd spent some time in the States previously, so I joined her here. And in the last 3 years, we own a house here. We've slowly sort of become home here. As Diane mentioned, I've been working at the Holy Trinity as an assistant organist since more or less since I got here. After a few months, I got that job. I don't know if any of you know John Lowe, but he's the charismatic leader there, and I assist him wherever I can on the organ. And yeah, just this year, well, last year, I was Dr. Lee went on paternity leave, so I covered for him at UF, and then a new opportunity came this year. So now I'm teaching oral skills there. So that's been really nice. That was always a big part of the picture here at Gainesville, just to hopefully get a foothold into the UF scene and just be reemerge into that musical environment. And it's been really nice to be back inside those, back within a music school and back around musicians and that sort of thing. So. So things are very busy, and we have a 10-month-old at home of our own now. So things have gotten even busier in the last few months, certainly. So what I'll do, I know I have a few topics to cover here, but I don't really often get a chance to just talk about my upbringing and sort of what how I came to be where I am now. So I'll spend some time doing that. I'll play some music later as well, but I'll try to give you as full a picture I can here in our time together. So. I was born in Ottawa. That city came up a few times in the introduction. It's a little bit in the news today. I don't know if you're following that, but born in Ottawa, it's the capital of Canada. And I was very fortunate in my circumstances growing up because, as it happens, actually both of my grandfathers were piano teachers in the Toronto area. And actually, that's how my parents met. Their respective parents were sort of friendly rivals in the neighborhood, and so they got together through that connection. So of course, music was very much cherished around the house, and I was encouraged to pursue it. And we had a piano in our house that was, passed down from my mom's father. But in addition to that, of course, whenever I got to go visit with one of my grandfathers, they had these enormous libraries of sheet music. So anytime I got to go visit them, I could sort of immerse into this world where I got to explore different music just by playing the sheet music. So this was sort of a magical time for me growing up. And early on, it was clear to me, although the piano was my main instrument, I wasn't so much interested in mastering the instrument unto itself. That was sort of what I was being trained to do, do scales, do technique. And of course, that's important to an extent, but really what the piano has always been for me, it's been a vehicle to experience music and to explore different musical worlds. And that, again, that's sort of how I regard it today. And I should practice more and do some of those technical things, but really it's a vehicle. It's actually, in a true sense, it's an instrument of discovery for me. So I started studying piano at age 7, and around age 12, I had started to branch out, and this inner desire to sort of better understand music and sort of how it's put together extended naturally. So I was just on the first slide here. So as I was describing, I started taking piano lessons around 7 formally, and around the age of 11 or 12, I really started to branch out, and I was doing a lot of just sort of like study work to try to better understand the music I was playing. And around that time, it was really Bach, the music of J.S. Bach, that I was trying to better understand. So I started writing little like style studies, little suites like gavottes and jigs and that sort of thing. And every so often I try a fugue, and counterpoint was something that really interested me from an early age, because it was a puzzle. It was just like a fun puzzle to try to figure out. And so I almost hesitate to call those early years as being composition, but I was writing music. It wasn't really my music in the true sense, but it was putting notes on a page. And so that prompted my parents, who were very supportive, of course, at that time, to take some lessons. And so although I was taking composition lessons, it was really just theory and harmony lessons, just to learn some of the foundations of music. And just after that, I took a year of organ studies, which, it's the only year of organ training that I actually have. And don't tell John Lowe that, because he thinks that I have more training than that. I'm sort of figuring it out on the fly. But I have played organ sort of off and on before moving to Gainesville, where I didn't expect it to become such a regular thing, but we do what we can as musicians to survive. But while I was doing my piano work, I was also enrolled in a pretty intensive program for a men and boys choir. In Ottawa, we were lucky. There's 2 men and boys choirs. I think they're both still going. And this was a really intense experience early in my life. I think we had rehearsals Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. So we'd meet as a boys choir on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then Friday the men would join us. And then on Sunday we do a service or 2, always one in the morning, sometimes an evensong at night. And so this was just like a very, very intensive program for learning music in a different way. So I had this sort of dual pronged, it wasn't set up to be this way, but it was really the perfect environment to be raised as a musician, because on the one hand, I was taking a sort of bird's eye view of music as a pianist, because when you play piano, you sort of play the whole piece and you get a sense of texture and harmony. But then as a boy chorister, you start to learn about breathing and line and musicianship in a more intimate way. And of course, the voice as a producer of music and sound is totally different from a keyboard. So this was a tremendously valuable experience with me. I had a very charismatic director for a number of years there that made a very strong impact as well. And then of course, when my voice broke, I don't know when, it was 13 or 14, I actually stayed in the choir after that for a few years. And then of course I was singing in the bass and tenor lines, depending on how I felt that day. But when you're singing those low parts, of course, you experience music in a totally different way, because you're inside the music, right? You're sort of seeing it from the inside out, which I had never had that experience before. And it was, also a very profound experience to write that way. And of course, as a composer, you have to be able to think about the perspectives of all the different people you're writing for, if you're writing for a large ensemble. So I actually place a lot of importance on those years, just singing tenor in a men's choir, and of course singing soprano in a boys choir. So anyways, these were all very, very formative experiences between piano, composing, organ, and men's choir. Now, while I was undergoing those studies, of course, there were a few composers that really stood out and formed the sort of really basis for my love of music. And so I'll isolate three of them here. And it just so happens that those three names, for whatever reason, they're actually contemporaneous with different student times in my life. So J.S. Bach was really the foundation layer for so much of my musical appreciation and enjoyment. And he was my preoccupation throughout middle school, and I guess maybe even a little bit before that. But just as I started to navigate the terrain of music, and I was just exceedingly curious and passionate about discovering how, like, the sort of miraculous way that he went about writing music. And it wasn't just the craftsmanship, but it was also the variety. Like the Well-Tempered Clavier was really, they call it the Old Testament of music. It really was sort of a Bible to me for a number of years. And I used to run home from school just trying to understand, okay, in this fugue, where does the fugue appear? And I would have such thrill discovering, oh, here's the subject in inversion, or there's some other thing, some other permutation that Bach placed on it. And just the amount of different musical worlds that could be unpacked by Bach just in these 48 works, it was an astonishment to me. And again, it was a primary preoccupation for 2 or 3 years of my life, especially, and it certainly informed sort of how I think about polyphony and putting different notes together and that sort of thing. When I moved on to high school, Brahms just happened to become a fellow traveler for those years. Part of it is because his music, it builds on Bach's in certain important textural and harmonic ways, and of course it expands the harmonic palette of that world. But also just musically, it was a good companion during years. As a teenager, you're sort of a little bit awkward and shy and alienated. I think that's most of our experience at that stage in life. And Brahms was sort of a warm companion during that time. And I discovered first his piano works, especially the late works, but I also discovered his symphonies at that time, which were profoundly important to me. And then certainly chamber music. There's enormously well-crafted and inspired music there to discover. So that was the main preoccupation for those 4 years. And then getting to college, Gustav Mahler was really the central figure for the 4 years of college. And if I were to describe just my own discovery of Bach and Brahms, and certainly other composers as well, but those two centrally as being this like series of small explosions, like benign explosions within me. Mahler was like an atomic bomb. When I discovered Mahler, what happened with Mahler was that as I was, unpacking the music of Brahms, I was sort of turning a blind eye to this sort of parallel stream of music, namely through like Wagner, but even Beethoven to an extent. I had sort of skipped over him, and his music was sort of bombastic to me. It didn't really appeal to my sensibilities. And so when I was forced to confront Mahler, and this was just by sheer luck, in my first year of university, they were doing the Second Symphony, which has a choir at the end of it. And I was just some lowly tenor, you sit through about an hour and 10 minutes, you just sit there patiently while the orchestra goes through 4.5 movements of just like enormous material, and then at the end you sing, sort of like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And I can directly remember the moment when I was just sitting there on stage and just understanding like my whole life was just like being blown up by this music. And the next 4 years, maybe more like 3 years, I went through each symphony from one to the next, and each one was just like this like profound experience of just expanding my mind and what music could possibly be. Of course, Mahler has this famous quote that a symphony should be like a world; it should contain everything. And that was certainly my experience of it. And I had no idea that music could reach, so far expressively, but also sonically. And this was really the sort of like the sort of critical moment in my life where, in a sense, music went from being something that I really liked to something that became almost vocational. It was sort of, this is what you have to do now because you had no choice, because Mahler thrust you into this. So this sort of sense of being carried by music, that this was something that characterized my experience with Mahler. And again, it happens with other composers with me, but everything was encoded within that. Not just, the German tradition leading from Brahms to Bach, but the Wagnerian sort of operatic scale, Beethoven bombast. Of course, there's like a lot of like, there's tons of cosmopolitan, like klezmer music. There's everything is contained within it. So this was really just like an ear-shattering experience for me, the works of Mahler. So just to briefly touch on my own path as a composer. So this was already sort of touched on in the introduction, but that first undergraduate degree was at McGill. I already had a pretty strong backing in theory, and it just so happened in my fourth year, I took a few seminars and got a theory double major. And then at the end of that degree, I could just sort of sense instinctively that I needed to sort of change and maybe move away from Canada and experience a new environment. So I ended up going to Rice University over in Houston. Very different environment for McGill. McGill was a big school, a research school. There's certainly a lot of talented people there, but Rice is a very small, very selective conservatory, and the level of performance there was extremely high. And of course, as a composer, that's what you want to do. And actually, what really drew me to Rice was the promise of an orchestral performance. So as composers, young composers, you always want to find that first gateway into an orchestra performing your work. That is the sort of crown jewel of what you aspire to. And at that point, I had only had sort of minor reading sessions, and I knew the Rice Orchestra had this sterling reputation. So actually, that was a very important factor in me deciding to go there. The promise of having that performance, and just sort of having my orchestral baptism in a sense. At Rice, my music evolved somewhat. I'm not going to share any music from those years because honestly, it feels so long ago, and I think I was still really learning the basics. I hadn't even really come to terms with contemporary music in a deep sense, but I knew that I had to get there. So this sort of leads to the next stage of my life, the Manhattan School thing. This was certainly not preordained in any of my vision for how my career would go. Again, as a pianist, the piano was always just a means of discovery. It was never something I was going to undertake as like a serious discipline. But when I was at Rice, because I was around these amazing performers all the time, just because, again, it was such a selective environment, I ended up becoming like the new music guy, because a lot of people there were just there to sort of learn how to do an orchestra audition and that sort of thing. But because I started to gain a reputation as someone who was more adventurous and interested in doing new music, I met a few other people that were interested in that, and I started to perform more, actually, just being inspired around these great musicians. And a couple of them, a clarinet player and a violinist who were completing their undergrads at the same time, made me aware of this specialized program at the Manhattan School of Music in contemporary performance. At the time, it was the only one of its kind. I believe there's a second one now. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It's a 2-year master's program where you go there, and it's very intensive, and you learn all of the specialized skills required for the execution of contemporary music. So like a really heavy emphasis on rhythmic complexity, of course, more advanced harmonic, things like that. And this was something I felt that I knew I wanted to do a doctorate, but I wasn't quite ready to do that. I didn't quite know enough about the music I wanted to write to make that decision where I wanted to do a doctorate. So I went to Manhattan. I spent 3 years there, and these were intense years for sure, because when you're in New York, you're really on the front lines of music making. And this was really the first time where I was thrust into this environment where every day you're confronting different, like radically different types of music, and you're really on the avant-garde, of music. And it really wasn't until that time in my life where I was ready to experience that. And in some cases, I wasn't quite ready, and there's some really shocking sonic experiences that happened during that time, but none that I would ever, take back. I mean, this is tremendously valuable. And of course, as a pianist, you got to see the music from a different perspective. So this is what I tell people. They see my resume. I have this small collection of degrees, and I'll tell them that of the 4 degrees I've done, I only did 1 in performance, and I learned the most as a composer in that degree. And the reason for that is because when you perform music and you're performing it regularly, you're just experiencing music in a much more intimate and much more impactful way. As a composer, you're always sort of a step outside of the music. And that's valuable in some contexts, certainly. But when you're actually in there making music and you're actually feeling the energy of performers and reacting to them, you gain a much deeper and intimate understanding of sort of how music is put together, especially contemporary music. So again, these 3 years in New York were absolutely formative for me. but not just as a pianist, but as a composer as well. I sometimes thought of myself as like a double agent. You know, I was presenting myself as a performer, and certainly I took that element of it seriously. But I was also secretly there as a composer, you know, to take in as many things as I could. And certainly I did take a lot of things in during those 3 years. And then after that, for various reasons, I decided to return to McGill. I did a doctorate there. I feel like the first few years of that was just digesting everything that I came across in Manhattan. I mean, certainly Montreal has a lively scene and there's a lot of new music happening there, but it's not on the same level as New York. So it was just a matter of sort of coming to terms with what I'd encountered and trying to actually then forge some sort of artistic identity, which I would say to that point hadn't really been top of mind. It would be much more about just taking things in, always taking things in and being a student. And I don't think it's uncommon. You know, you encounter the odd composer now who writes, you know, blazingly original music at 20, even 19 years old or whatever, but that's the exception, not the norm. I mean, the Mendelssohns and the Mozarts of before who would write, you know, these masterpieces at 14, 15 years old, it's just not the way the world is anymore. It's not to say that it couldn't happen, but there's a certain accumulation that happens throughout musical history, and you have to be conversant and really fluent in all those different musics to be able to contribute something original. And so it's very common when I talk to my colleagues, you know, they've basically, most of what they wrote before the age of 30 was sent to the dustbin. You know, it's not something that has to be the case, but it certainly was the case for me. It's a long journey, but it's certainly a joyful journey and full of so many wonderful discoveries and the curiosity of being a composer, which I regard as perhaps at a higher level as the discipline and work of being a composer. The curiosity is really the ultimate element of being a composer in my mind. And when I teach a composer, that's sort of what I look for. And unfortunately, it's a hard thing to teach. You know, it's sort of an intangible characteristic that one has to just have as a creator in the first place. So I will play two pieces. What I'll do is maybe I won't play the whole piece, but I'm going to play an orchestra piece from 2016. So I was 30 years old when I wrote this, sure enough. And I'll introduce it a little bit. And then maybe after that, I can take some questions. I could also maybe spend a few, because I think I was prompted to talk a little bit about the artistic process, like how I go about writing music. And I could try to do that, although it's pretty mysterious even to this day, but I could try to do that. And then after that, I have another piece that I could play maybe a longer section for. So this work, it's called Spacious Euphony. It was commissioned by the National Youth Orchestra of Canada. And every year, I think it's still the case, but at the time, every year they would have one commissioned composer that would be featured on their summer program, and then they would tour that program, sometimes in Canada, sometimes internationally. But there was one piece of new music that would be focused on. And this was like definitely a prized opportunity for composers, because it's actually, you know, for a youth orchestra, it's really a very high level orchestra. It's a training program for aspiring orchestra musicians in Canada, but just by the way, the nature of their program, there's a long period of gestation where they learn the program before they go on tour. So it wasn't going to be the standard, you know, in new music. Often, if you're at an orchestra piece, you'll get 30 minutes of rehearsal, like really a shockingly little amount of time. But this was a case where there could be a long incubation period. And I knew that I could write something that was ambitious and showed me off, but also showed them off. And indeed, having heard the National Youth Orchestra, this being my first proper orchestra commission, I really relished the opportunity to write for a youth orchestra, because there's a certain energy that comes with it. I don't know if anyone here has seen a youth orchestra, but there's a buzz usually when there are, you know, younger musicians on a stage, and this is something I wanted to harness in the piece, certainly. And I guess I shouldn't say this is my first orchestra piece, because I had written that thesis work for Rice, but I regard that as a sort of like a baby step, an important one, no doubt, but not a piece that I regard as being highly original at this point. But what I discovered through that earlier piece was that the orchestra, what it meant to me and what it promised to me was the opportunity to explore all kinds of different sonic environments and lots of different types of mixture. Some people approach the orchestra as a sort of monolith of sound. It's like, okay, the orchestral sound, and sort of as a tutti, everyone playing together. And I really looked at it in a more atomized way. Like, what are all the different ways that I can combine all these different interesting combination of instruments and what new sounds can emerge out of that, and what sort of energy can be gained from that. And I actually, to that end, I gave it the subtitle Concerto Grosso, which is a genre. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. But this kind of goes back to Bach, the Brandenburg concertos. Those are some of the most famous concerti grosso, concerto grossi. And that genre, of course, it's characterized by this combination of an ensemble, like a background ensemble, and then a collection of soloists on stage. So instead of just being a concerto where there's one soloist, it's a collection of them. And so in the Brandenburgs and in other works of that kind, there's all these wonderful things that a composer can do where you can explore textures just within the solos, and then you can explore textures within the background sort of orchestra, the sort of the Greek chorus, you could think of it. And then, of course, in between the two, there's all types of, there's a sort of continuum of sounds that you can explore between soloists and orchestra. So I really love that idea. So this piece, it's sort of like a concerto for orchestra. There aren't soloists positioned in front of the orchestra like you would see, but because of the way some of the lines are written out, I think of it as like little mini concertos for different instruments. And of course, this was strategic on my part because young musicians, what do they want to do? They want to show off. They want to have things that'll make them look good. And so I was definitely harnessing that to our mutual benefit in the piece. So the piece is Spacious Euphony. It's about 13 minutes long. I think I won't play the whole thing, but I'll play the first half or so. So I'm going to play it. I'll stop it there. It's about 2/3 of the piece. Hopefully everyone was able to hear that. Yeah, so if you have any questions about that piece, I'd love to hear them now. I didn't do much else by way of introduction to the work itself, but you could hear some influences there, and you could hear that there's a lot of contrast from one section to the next. Certainly the opening it was almost like you could hear me introducing myself to the orchestra, the way it sort of moves from one instrument to the next. I had one friend say it was like shaking hands, oh, here's the oboe, here's the clarinet. A very organic way of writing, which certainly, bears its influence from people like Brahms, who would write in a similar way. But is there any feedback from that? I'm gonna have one other thing to play later, but yeah, Richard.
I guess what was interesting to me was to see if you would bring any national Canadian sounds in the process. I mean, if you think about music as a novice that I am, that when I hear some music like Finlandia, I associate that with a particular music nationalism that comes through. You can also hear it in the Moldau and other kind of crafts that have local kind of, but I was wondering, since Canada and the US are really modern contemporaries, which I think was in your music, I just wondered if there was any elements in pure Canadian music. I spent a little time at Dalhousie University in
Oh, did you?
Maritimes.
Great.
And there's a definite overtone of Scottish
Yeah.
heritage in the music that comes out of there. And I was
Yeah.
wondering that when you get to the plains from, around Toronto westward,
Yeah.
you get a very similar experience to Kansas and so forth.
Sure.
And I just wondered about, did you ever think about adding nationalism to the music themes? And is there a Canadian
Yeah.
sound?
That's a great question. Yeah. I think maybe that's more to the point, is what is Canadian music? And this is something that's been discussed a lot among Canadian composers, because I think you mentioned the idea of what is a pure Canadian sound? What would a pure Canadian music sound like? And actually the answer to that is I think a lot of people would bristle at that very notion, right? Because Canada is, they are very proud of being such a cosmopolitan and multicultural place, of course, and not to get into the weeds on that, but that has implications in our national identity. And certainly Canada was not, like you mentioned, Finlandia. That era of like hyper nationalism and that period, especially in the 19th century, when nationalism really took hold in places like Finland and Italy and Germany and elsewhere. Canada was, barely a country at that point. We got our constitution in 1867. And, from the start, it was always this partly because of geography as well, but it was always this ragtag of different, ethnicities, of course, predominantly, like you say, Scottish, Irish, English. But over time, just especially because of the expanse of territory that we inhabit and relatively sparsely, that has impeded the growth of a sort of national style. And some would celebrate that, and some would decry that. It depends on your perspective. But the sort of the era when nationalism was really in vogue, like in the late 19th, early 20th century, Canada was, again, very much in its infancy then. So that was the time when we would have forged some sort of national style. And since then, music and culture has become so pluralistic, and it's hard to really pin down what that is. For me personally, and even America, I would put in that category. I mean, I think there is an American sound that we can more or less identify, and there are tunes that one identifies with distinctly American sound. For Canada, I think what a lot of scholars talk about is the environment itself. And so as artists, and I might talk about this a little more in the next piece, it's not something that I necessarily directly engage with, but it is utterly inescapable growing up in Canada, the physical environment that you're born into. And that has profound implications. I think it's fair to say that has implications on the music that emerges out of Canada. And you can compare it in some sense to the Nordic countries like Finland and Norway. Again, although they do have some of their own national heroes, there's a sort of spaciousness and sparsity to that people relate to the landscape. This wide swaths of land. I grew up in Ottawa, so it's a more forested area, but you feel that proximity. And I think what I've done, not so much in this piece. I mean, this piece was really, more about, writing for performers and exploring craft sort of on its own terms. But what I've come to be more sensitive to, especially since I ironically leaving Canada, in a weird way, you become more sensitive to what you've lost, right? The sense of awe that comes in those landscapes, even if they're just imagined. I've never been up north to the Barrens region, like the polar region, but it's something that exists in every Canadian's imagination. And people have talked about that. It's an inescapable part of our consciousness, and it's something that I think I've tried to embrace more recently. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we don't have a sort of a national, in a sense, like a jingoistic project that resembles anywhere else in the world. But I think that you can draw traces of different sounds together and start to parse out, like, this is sort of what a Canadian music sounds like. But for the most part, we're so heterogeneous that it's sort of a fool's game to try to pin that down, especially in the 21st century. I don't know if you have a follow-up to that.
I keep thinking that the sound would be of a loon.
A loon, yeah, it's a beautiful
Loon
sound.
in
Yeah,
the wilderness.
yeah,
Sound,
yeah.
big prairie, and the big north.
Well, even just the idea of a sound in the wilderness, like a lone sound in the wilderness. I mean, that has strong musical connotations to it, and I'll try to touch on that in the next piece. But that's sort of isolation, the sort of isolation that comes with being Canadian. Of course, we have big cities that are, people like to characterize Canada as being entirely like that. I mean, Toronto is a huge city, and it feels like any other American city. But again, we feel the expanse, and growing up in Ottawa, although, you're very close to a lot of big towns. If you go north of Ottawa, there is nothing. There are a couple of small, regional towns, mining towns, that kind of thing, but you're really on the threshold to nothingness. And I draw on that in a sense. So, yeah. So just to touch a little bit on, before going on to the next piece, because I want to maybe play a 10-minute excerpt after this. Just to talk a little bit about how I write music and how I think about music. I mean, there's a sort of mysterious alchemy that goes into writing music that's really undefinable, and I think that's okay. I think if you really take a deeply analytical view to writing music, it becomes sort of it can sort of work against you in a sense. I think you have to retain a certain degree of mystery to sort of that guides you into exploring unknown worlds. I would say that, this is how I sort of know that I've gained a certain level of maturity, because early on, let's say throughout my 20s, when I wrote a piece of music, it always felt like I was pursuing some pre-formed idea, and it was my task to discover it, if that makes sense. There was a sort of, once I gained access to an idea, there was a preformed idea, there's a preformed composition that lay beyond it, that it was my task to sort of uncover. And there was a certain satisfaction in that, because when you're writing a piece of music in that way, then you can feel, okay, if I just put in the work, then I'll discover what this piece is intended to be. And then when it's done, then it really is done, because you've done the work of uncovering it. And so when I wrote with that mindset, finishing a piece of music was tremendously satisfying, because I felt like I had reached its full potential. But then, of course, when you hear the piece and you get exposed to other music, your world gradually expands, and you start to question that. And then that's gradually the creative process that one undergoes. And increasingly over time, you start to adopt the opposite mindset, which is sort of going back to what I was just saying earlier. There is nothing but wilderness, and the gaining of artistic maturity comes with it an understanding of just the absolute vastness of sonic possibilities that exists. And so on the one hand, this is inspiring, because you really start to feel like you're an authentic craftsman, because you actually have agency and you can write music, and you can contribute something meaningful that's new. But on the other hand, it's terrifying, because there's no guardrails to sort of guide you on your path. And this is why a lot of composers, when they reach a certain age, they either stop writing or they write very little, and because the self-critical mechanism goes into overdrive, and you understand that things can have any multitude of possible paths, and you're just trying to do the best to pick the best path possible as you navigate a piece of music. So it's exhilarating on the one hand, but it's also sort of a terrifying thing, and it gets harder as you age. So when I write music, again, there's a certain mystery to it. I don't particularly highly regard the idea of inspiration. I don't know if other people have talked about that concept. Again, there's a mysterious element to writing music, but I think most of it is just sitting down and working, and working things out and not waiting for inspiration to strike. I think that implies a certain passivity that doesn't really jive with my idea of music. But when I write music now, I've always used a pencil. I don't just write into the computer. I've never done that. Certainly now the eraser is getting as much or even more of a workout than the pencil, and that's just a consequence of having stronger critical faculties and, having a better mastery of what you're doing. So, and I actually like that. Like I have students that come to me and they just write into the computer and I say, okay, there's some value in that, but because it looks good, but that can be deceiving because you can write a piece of music on the page on the computer and you print it out and it looks like music, but you haven't really done the work of really grasping with it, getting your hands dirty. So I've come to sort of relish that part of it. Actually, it's just like, one of my scores now is just a mess of, crossed out notes and erasures and this sort of thing. And I like the messiness of it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I'm trying to embrace that. So that's I guess as much of a window as I can give it into my creative process. But again, it's a mystery to me even at this time. So look, I have about 10 minutes left. We can go a little bit after that because we've already talked a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about my latest project, and it's a piano concerto. So this is the big project that actually was supposed to, if you can believe it was supposed to be performed in March of 2020. So I had spent a year writing this piece, and then of course it got delayed, and it's just been subjected to all these delays since then because of the pandemic. But this is an orchestra in Toronto that commissioned me, and as a pianist and composer, if you get the commission to write a concerto that you will perform, this is sort of this is a singular moment in your life. You don't get these opportunities very often, so it's tremendously exciting to get that call. And there's the question, like, do you want to do this? Do you want to perform it? And I took a day to think about it, but of course, because the stakes are high when you're in front of an orchestra. I haven't done a lot of performing in front of an orchestra myself, but certainly there's nothing higher to aspire to, is being able to write your own piano concerto, perform it with a professional orchestra. So, like I said, I spent about a year writing this piece. It's in 3 movements, and you see the movement titles there. The first movement is called Reflections, second movement Echoes, and the third movement Rainbows. And the titles actually, they're inspired by a text by Aristotle, actually. He wrote a text called Posterior Analytics. And in there, he has this little, he has this small fragment where he talks about, I think he calls it the changeable contents of fixed categories. So he relates the phenomena of reflections, echoes, and rainbows to this unified phenomenon, which is namely the idea of like a rebounding effect, right? So like a reflection is the rebounding of light against a surface, and echoes, of course, is the rebounding of sound against a surface. And rainbows, well, he didn't really understand the idea of refraction at the time, but he in his mind, it was at one with the idea of echoes and reflections. So I think he saw the idea of like colliding water molecules in air as being part of the same idea. So I came across this independent of thinking about the concerto, and I was just struck by this, just the beauty of thinking of these 3 things as one unified idea. And then in relation to the concerto, I started thinking about this rebounding idea is so central to the piano, like the physical action of a piano. Because of course, when you strike a key on the piano, it's the rebounding of the hammer against the string. So I thought, what a beautiful metaphor to sort of uncover from within the action of a piano, and maybe like an idea for how to a gateway into a sound world that could inspire a large piece of music, like a piano concerto. So the way I made this into music, in Reflections, the first movement, it's sort of a double meaning, because on the one hand, there's a certain reflection on the concerto tradition and my own life as a sort of autobiographical element whenever you write a piano concerto. But also in a literal sense, there are reflections in the sense that throughout the first movement, when you hear something high up, like when you hear something voiced by, let's say, a high instrument like the flute or the violin, or the right hand of the piano, there's very often something happening, like a mirror image of it happening on the low end. So being voiced by, bassoon, cello, or the left hand of the piano. Now it's not literal. That idea has been explored actually in literal fashion by some composers, but it's a sort of distorted mirror. I think that's like a really interesting idea of like a sort of like a fractured mirror. And so I love that idea of like a sort of x-axis, like a continuum around which different sounds mirror each other. They reflect upon each other. And so that was sort of the guiding principle for the first movement. And then what's interesting about echoes in the second movement, it's sort of like a reflection around the y-axis of time. So the sounding, the voicing of a single sound will be like rebounded and echoed throughout the orchestra, if that makes sense. So a sound will be heard, and then you'll hear its sort of echo or sort of rebound coming from without the orchestra. And so this is an effect that can be explored when you're a pianist within an ensemble, because you have this, again, this goes back to the Concerto Grosso idea. You have a soloist and you have the ensemble. You have this very tense relationship where you have everyone's focused in on the soloist, this very intimate object at the center of the stage, and then you have the surrounding chorus, and there's all sorts of interesting effects that you can achieve through that dynamic. And so that was what I explored in the second movement. I don't know if we'll have time to explore that today, but that's what happens there. And then the rainbows is sort of a combination of those two. So the idea is really just like a sort of, how do I describe it? It's like blurred streaks of sound across. So basically different glissandi of sound that sort of go up and down. It's a sort of synthesis of the two ideas, if that makes sense. And that's such a very short movement. So the reflections, the first movement is quite long. It's about half the piece. Echoes is about 8 minutes, and then rainbows is only 4 minutes. It's almost like just an epilogue to the piece. So the whole piece is about 24 minutes. I won't play the whole thing, but I actually just got this recording. We recorded it in November in Toronto. We weren't originally planning to do this, but the pandemic, we decided to make it happen. And I just recently actually finished editing the recording. So you're actually among the first people that are able to hear this recording, which is exciting. So what I'm going to do is play the first 10 minutes or so of reflections, and then we'll have some time for questions after that, if that's okay. So I'll stop there. That's only the first movement, if you can believe it. But I wanted to do the whole thing. As you can hear, this is the sort of Mahlerian principle was at work here. I mean, I really wanted to embrace a lot of different sounds in the piece, because the piano, I'm not that old, but I've had a long life with the piano, and there's so many different ways to explore that instrument in a context like this. So that's why you heard, by turns, sometimes the music is extremely intimate and delicate and melodic and sonorous. Other times it can be more percussive and loud and boisterous. It was really just a way, it was almost like a love letter to the piano, writing this piece. So I hope you enjoyed that. And I'd love to hear any feedback. I know we went a little bit over time there, but I think there's still lots of time for questions. I'd love to hear some.
Don, do you want to lead us off?
I did have a question going back to your Concerto Grosso,
Yeah.
where I think you said you tried to feature various parts of the orchestra without bringing them out front, as soloists.
Yeah.
What role and how important is the conductor in enabling and drawing out your vision for the piece? What would you say about that?
That's a great question. I mean, as composers, we are so beholden to the skill and attitude of our conductors. I mean, a lot of conductors will have sort of a pejorative view of new music just going into it, and that will color the way that the orchestra reacts to it, of course, because they are the conduit from you to the orchestra. So having a positive, that's more than half the battle, is just having a positive and enthusiastic supporter in your conductor. In the piece that you mentioned, the Concerto Grosso, there's a lot of work that can be done just in terms of balance and to encourage other, the musicians to understand what their role is. Because when you encounter a piece of like standard repertoire, like let's say a Beethoven symphony, you have that piece echoing in your head, right? Like if you play Beethoven 7, you know what it sounds like. When you have a flute solo, you know what the role is. And when you're a string player and it's the flute solo, you know that you're listening at that point. So in this case, there's a lot of balance work that goes on into that. So it's a great question. Honestly, most of that work is mine. It's a matter of being obsessed with sound and balance. And even the most experienced composers, they'll tell you when they write for orchestra, there are surprises. Mahler, just not to always go back to him, but when you look at he was even throughout his life revising his work. Even like I think the last thing he did before he died, he wasn't writing a new symphony. He was revising his Fifth Symphony, and you can follow these things as they progress, because once the work of being a composer is, especially when you're ready for an orchestra, is getting from the page to the stage, right? I didn't mean to rhyme that way, but you can get so obsessed with like the writing process, and a score can become like a work of art itself, right? I mean, you look at a beautiful score where everything's notated right, and you could be seduced in a way and look at it and say, this piece looks done, right? Like as a work of art, but that's not where the piece lives. The piece lives on stage, and that's why, as a performer, that was so instructive to me. It's about getting outside of that and getting onto the stage. And so again, so much of the work in that piece especially was just getting balance stuff. And that's why getting that early orchestra experience was so important, because you can get some of your failures out of the way. I mean, there's all composition and creativity. It's just a series of failures and lessons, right? But I remember in that piece, it was a youth orchestra, so they're a little bit more affable in terms of, they're not so grumpy. A lot of orchestra musicians are sort of sour and grumpy, but they were more open to it. But I distinctly remember in between breaks, like if they rehearsed my piece for half an hour and then they'd have a little break afterward, I would be thinking while I was listening, who are the performers that I'm going to hit? Because I have about 2 minutes before they go, have their lunch. I have to go over there and tell them, okay, this is what I want here. Like, you see the forte at measure 133, not good enough. You have to be fortissimo, or like you see the piano here, you're too loud. I need you to go down. And it's just like an endless process of balancing. And that's the work that goes into making a compelling piece of music, especially when you have every instrument you add creates, it invites a sort of like exponentially more possibilities for problems, right? With balancing. So that's really where the work of composition comes in on a large scale like that. Just thinking about it and trying to create an oral image of it that you can translate onto the page. Yeah. But thank you for your question. That's great.
Go ahead, Don. You can unmute.
Good. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Chris, that was wonderful. I really liked it. Early on, you talked about the creative process, and you talked about the absolute vastness of possibilities. No guardrails on one hand being exhilarating, and on the other hand being terrifying.
Yep.
I've always been of the opinion, perhaps incorrectly, that sometimes the greatest creativity occurs when the parameters are the narrowest. In other words, when you don't have a totally blank canvas, so to speak. So when you start in with this blank canvas, do you ever create guardrails for yourself?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, as soon as you write one note, like if you imagine my concerto, 24 minutes of music, as soon as you write one note, there are implications for that note. Not necessarily restrictions, but there are certain implications that go with that. And every note that you write after that creates more implications. You know what I mean? So it's not, again, it's not the mindset I had earlier where it's like, okay, you write this chord and then it will ultimately, it's predetermined to go to this particular, like you still have a lot of agency in where things go, but that doesn't mean the notes don't have implications. They don't take on a life of their own. What you're talking about is like definitely been a preoccupation of composers of the 20th century, especially because before the 20th century, you know, when the tonality, you know, as a structural system was just understood to be what like uncoupleable from music, that had its own internal tensions, right? So when you listen to Beethoven, you listen to Bach, there are certain notes that belong and certain that don't, and so those parameters, those strictures are built into the system in a sense, and it's the job of the composer to push against those. And that was very much my experience growing up was, okay, here's Bach pushing the envelope in terms of what like sort of dissonances you can do. And then with Brahms, it was what sort of new sort of chromatic harmonies, you know, if I, not to get too technical, but get away from just the 7-note scale to the 12-note, the full 12-note universe. Like, what can we do there? And then with Mahler, really the threshold being pushed there was timbre, in my view. Like it wasn't just harmony, but it was actually just the way sound is. And so in the 20th century, when all that sort of gets discarded, the shackles of tonality, you have to make your own parameters. So yes, there's an oxymoron there that you know, how does one put it? Stravinsky wrote about this extensively. He talks about how freedom is only gained through limitations, right? And that's the paradox. So the more restrictions you impose on yourself, the more freedom that you have. There's a line that people say now, discipline equals freedom. That's sort of a calling card for some people. I mean, it's sort of the same principle, right? I mean, it's the same idea. It's that only through that rigorous application of discipline and rules that you can gain that. But ultimately, you are still the one determining what rules to impose. And that's, again, that is the challenge of being a musician in the 21st century, is that you don't inherit any of that. I mean, you have this as background, right? You understand the history of music, and it's in the background of your acoustic space that you're writing out of. But ultimately, you have to determine where those rules are. And that's where so much of the creative process is already encoded, right? Is building that in. So, and it's a great question. And just for this concerto, it was really about trying to open up as much as possible, because what I've come to understand is, and I tell my students this, you have limitations when you go to write a piece of music. There are so many limitations within you that you don't understand, right? I can hear them, but you can't hear them because it's just because of the limitations of the experience you've had. We all have them. So I actually try to encourage students to be to adopt as liberal a mindset as possible as far as like exploring new sounds, because there's already so much baked in limitations just technically and that. So usually, you know, the work of a composer is to learn the rules and then to unlearn them, right? And that's been a lot of what I've, you know, that's been my journey at least.
Thank you very much.
Let's go to Michael. Actually, I'm sorry, Barb, I think had her hand up first, maybe.
Okay, I think I just unmuted. Yeah, I had a question. When you were writing for the youth orchestra, and I put some of this in the chat, many years ago, I was in the Massachusetts State Youth Orchestra. And so I know what that's like. How did you write differently for a youth orchestra than you would have written for an adult orchestra?
Yeah, that's a great question. This youth orchestra, of course, youth orchestra can take a lot of different guides. There's like local youth orchestras. This was a national youth orchestra. I had heard them play before, and I knew from my own experience hearing them play and by testimony from people around them that they were pretty close to the level of a professional orchestra. So I actually didn't, just again, based on talking to people and hearing them, and maybe against my better judgment, I decided to regard. I didn't limit myself in terms of what I wanted to write. That's obviously a luxury as a composer that you don't always have. I mean, you have to know, and I've had some hard lessons that way. Believe me, like writing for groups and writing music that was too complex and having things suffer that way. But in general, it's a hard thing. My music is difficult, and it's been received that way by a lot of people, certainly. I try to look at I use Nietzsche's idea of creativity. He says to create is to esteem, right? It's like while writing something hard, I believe in you. I believe in you to be able to write it, and if you fail, then we fail together, kind of thing. There's a collaborative spirit to it, and that I try to. If you're not meeting me and you're playing my music, you might not necessarily have that mindset. And a lot of musicians that are just steeped in classical, the common practice music, they'll look at a score that's difficult and they bristle at it. They don't want to write it. But I think ultimately my most profound experiences and fruitful experiences as a composer and as a performer have been ones where you go on this journey together with the performer or with the composer, where there's a sort of enlightenment that happens throughout that process. Otherwise, music is just this like raw exchange of goods and services, and that's not really what music is to me. There has to be a learning element to it, not in a didactic sense, but in the sense that you come away from it changed in some way. So anyway, that's a long way of saying I didn't really take that into much account. It was more I was emphasizing the positive elements of a youth orchestra, like I talked about. It's like young people, they're very they're confident, they're cocky, they want to show off, and they have a lot of raw energy. And that was what I wanted to tap into the piece. Yeah, thanks for your question. Michael?
Yes, thank you. I have two unrelated questions, and I don't know if you'll have time for the second one. But you talked about going from page to stage. When you hear a piece of your music actually performed by an orchestra, is there ever a time that you feel that maybe the sound isn't quite what you expected when you wrote it, and then go back to the page and make some adjustments? That's one question. The other one is, you talked about how different composers have influenced you over the course of your musical development. One thing I've always wanted to know is, how does a conducting teacher work with a student? How did your teachers influence your development? And how do you work with your own students in helping them to achieve what they're trying to?
Yeah, sure. You mean composer, composing teacher? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Great. I'll answer. Let's see. I'll answer the second question first. So, being a composition teacher is a really strange experience. I've done a little bit of it in different guises, a little bit at UF here with some of the grad composers, but a lot sort of ad hoc teaching at different levels. Ultimately, I find the more, in a weird way, the more enriching experiences I've had as a teacher is with younger students, because like I said at the beginning of my talk, curiosity is the number one ingredient when you're a creator. And if you encounter an adult composer that doesn't have that spark, and they sort of have the limitations that arise out of that, there's only so much you can do. I mean, you can expose them to different music and try to say, hey, like, check this out. Like this might, stir something in you. And certainly technically you can talk about, like I talked about balance and things like that. These are the crafts elements of composition that can be imparted, but it's such a personal thing, to write music. I find a sort of a certain distance has to be put in place when you're teaching composition, because you don't want your own music to be, you don't want your student to be a conduit for your own music. And you see that all the time, of course. Teachers with big egos and their students just write music like them, and they don't cultivate their own sound. So, the best teachers that I've had, if I'm being honest, I've had wonderful teachers, but by far my greatest teachers are long dead. They're the people that I listed earlier. They taught me how to write music, and their scores are the embodiment of those lessons, right? Bach being at the top of the list. But most teachers that have been like really profound influence on me. I mean, my doctoral advisor is a brilliant musician in Canada. His name is John Rea. And we barely talked about music in our lesson. We talked about life, we talked about philosophy, we talked about Wagner, we talked about all sorts of things, and we'd have these long conversations, and he was just trying to like light certain little fires, and get me moving in different directions. Of course, I was a mature composer at that time. I'm sure he would have taken a different tack if I was 19 years old. But it's a delicate balance to do that. But you have to understand where a student's coming from, what their needs are. But yeah, I like teaching younger people, because you can really impact them and you can expose them to a lot of good things. Your earlier question was about, what do you do if you write something and it doesn't sound like you envision it? Well, this is that's the moment you live for, and it's the moment that you die for. I mean, as a composer, right? Because you write something, and it's like you're on a roller coaster and you're in free fall when you have a piece of music played. I mean, it's a rush that you can't even explain, because you don't know what's going to come out, and again, it's exhilarating, but it's terrifying as well. It's because anything can happen, because it's not just about, sure, like if you're writing one part, you can have a pretty good sonic image. Like that's part of the work of being a composer. You develop like an inner ear, right? So you write a line and you can get a pretty good idea, sort of facsimile of what that's going to sound like in your head. But what you don't know is how that performer is going to react to the oboist next to them, and then to the violinist next to them. And all of a sudden, these complexities multiply really quickly. And of course, musicians are sensitive. They react to how they hear other musicians. And so the sum of the parts can add up to something that's totally different from what you envisioned. And ultimately, that's where that balance thing comes in. It's like, if you, most of, my scores have gone from, you write sort of middle of the road dynamics. Okay, yeah, like mezzo forte should be okay, to like, okay, you really have to go way over the top to get them to hear things in a certain way. I've had a lot of times when things just don't work out. And at that point, there's not much you can do, because unless you're in a really special setting where there's like a workshop and it's like specifically designed where it's like, okay, you're going to write something, you're going to hear it back, and then you're going to rewrite it. There are some places that exist for that, but for the most part, it's trial by fire. I mean, you have one chance to do it. You have a very fixed amount of rehearsal time. So like I was saying earlier, most of the only work you can do at that point is delete notes or change dynamics. I mean, there's like very basic things like that. Otherwise, you're at the whims of your performers. So there are hard lessons to learn along the way. There's very hard lessons, but slowly, if you're persistent, they add up, and you get better at doing those things. And then that sort of that distance between what you have in your head and the reality, it slowly gets closer. I mean, it's never going to be one, right? And you would never want it to be one, because otherwise, why write music if you can just recreate it perfectly like Mozart, But it's about getting close to that, and that's it's a lifelong pursuit, and that's part of the joy of writing.
Chris, this has been wonderful. I'm looking at the clock here. I think we have time for one final question or thought from anyone.
Don, I'd like to say, I'd like Chris to tell us about his next concert coming up at Holy Trinity, when it is, and how we might be able to get down there.
Sure. So Holy Trinity, this is March 13th. I'm in a trio with a horn player, a local horn player, and a violinist. So we're going to do a program. I'm going to play a short piece for organ and horn. It's a new piece, but that's just the one piece. And then we're going to do the Debussy Sonata for violin and piano, a wonderful short work. And then the second half of the program is going to be the Brahms Horn Trio, which is a really amazing 30-minute piece. Yeah, so we're going to play that here. at Holy Trinity downtown. We're actually going to do that program this Sunday down in Sarasota. So we'll get some of the kinks out, and March is going to be a great show. So I think there'll be a reception after, and yeah. And if you ever want to come by on a Sunday morning, I'm there just about every Sunday playing anthems and voluntaries and that sort of thing. So,
Well,
thanks
Holy
for-
Trinity has a fabulous music program. I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
John Lowe was involved in one of the earliest versions of this class called Meet the King of Instruments, the pipe organ, about
nice.
3
Okay.
years ago. And we all had an occasion to
Okay.
go to the church and hear him play and so on. It was wonderful.
Oh, you all went there in person.
Yes.
Oh,
We did a
awesome.
kind of a field trip.
Oh, awesome. That's a fantastic instrument. It's so much fun to play. And
It
John,
really is.
John is a character, so that
Yes.
would have been a lot of fun.
Great.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. We have
My
really
pleasure.
enjoyed this. At least I have, and I think everyone else has too. And next week, Don will be introducing Jim Sain, our last composer. The week after that, we will be back with Paul Richards with his opera. So we hope to see you all here next week and the week after. But thanks again, Chris. This is
My pleasure.
Thank you, Chris.
My pleasure. Have a good day.
Thank you again.